Okay, well, hello everybody joining us this afternoon for our October Day Lecture, the October Royal Australian Historical Society Day Lecture, to be presented by Andy Macqueen. Just a few housekeeping rules for anyone who's never attended one of our online talks before. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the talk, and you can put those in the chat bar or the Q&A bar. We prefer the Q&A bar, but if you can't find that or you have difficulty using it, you can use the chat. Okay, so I will now pass over to Christine Yates, RAHS Senior Vice President, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Philip, and welcome to everyone. I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal and the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, and anyone today who's present who comes from one of the Aboriginal groups. Today we're going to listen to a talk about a surveyor, cartographer, engineer and explorer, Francis Barrallier. He made significant contributions to colonial endeavours in terms of exploration, but of course, as often happens, people fall foul of others around them for their no fault of their own, really. And he fell foul to the feuding between his fellow Rum Corps officers and Governor King, and his talents were employed in the West Indies instead. In this talk, Andy Macqueen is going to argue that Barrallier's French origin and associations influenced his undertakings and his fate in the colony. Andy Macqueen OAM is a Blue Mountains historian, published 6 books and many other works, and has had several peer-reviewed papers published by the Blue Mountains Association of Cultural Heritage and organisations. And his topics include first contact surveying, conservation history, and his latest book is The Frenchman for Francis Barrallier, Life and Journeys, 1773 to 1853. Please join me virtually in welcoming Andy.
Thank you very much, Christine. And hello, everyone out there in Zoom land. I'm in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, in the country of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples. And to my south is the mountainous Gundungurra country that Francis Barrallier ventured into in 1802, a fact that first piqued my interest in the man many years ago. So today my talk is about this little-known protagonist in early colonial Australia, and a man who might have made a much greater mark had circumstances not conspired against him. Those circumstances arose in part, at least, because of his nationality. He was French. So until recently, he's been best known and really only known for that intriguing but unsuccessful attempt to cross the Blue Mountains that I alluded to in 1802. However, there was much more to him and his achievements. So today I'll be addressing what I see as the 2 most interesting aspects of his legacy. One has to do with his competency as a surveyor and cartographer, the other to do with his relatively progressive perspectives on cultural matters. So, but first, who was Francis Barrallier? Well, this isn't him. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. We don't have a portrait of Francis Barrallier, unfortunately, but these 2 men did have something in common, or a few things in common. They were of similar age, they were French nationality, and some events in Toulon shaped the careers and the lives of both men. So Francis Barrallier was born in 1773 in the French Mediterranean port of Toulon. His father was by the name of Jean-Louis Barrallier, and his wife Marie Antoinette Françoise Hernandez was his wife. She had Spanish origins. Now, his father was a prominent marine engineer, which was quite significant in terms of Barrallier's in life from then on, because 20 years later, in 1793, when the people of Toulon, who were predominantly royalist, they found themselves besieged by the revolutionaries. An Allied fleet led by the English protected them until the young Napoleon captured a crucial fort and started bombarding the fleet. here's a painting of the event by the artist André Faraud. There's a painting of, and if you've seen the movie Napoleon, you would have seen that event at the start of the movie. It was an action that launched Bonaparte's career, and it also shaped the destiny of young Barrallier, for some 7,500 residents of Toulon were evacuated by the English, including the Barrallier family. After a spell in Italy, they finished up in England, where Jean Barrallier, that's Francis's father, was employed designing ships and port facilities, basically to fight the French. Meanwhile, Jean trained his son Francis in engineering, surveying and drawing. Now, there's a lot of detail there in his life that I'll skip over, but essentially, in due course, this man, Charles Greville, provided support to the Barrallier family, and Francis earned his patronage. He was a politician, fairly wealthy politician, and he lobbied for Francis, and he lobbied Francis to actually become Surveyor General of New South Wales. There wasn't at that stage a useful Surveyor General. So it was that Barrallier sailed to the colony in late 1799, aged 26, with excellent references, but no firm offer of employment. Governor King at first gave him odd jobs, such as designing an orphanage at Parramatta that was never built. But in due course, he was appointed ensign in the New South Wales Corps, the infamous Rum Corps. Now, ensign was the most junior officer rank. Now, while in that capacity, he was appointed port engineer and was also sent on expeditions to conduct surveys at Bass Strait and at the Hunter, all in 1801. And more about those activities later. But as you can see, even though he was an ensign in the Rum Corps, he was being put to work as a surveyor. Now, Governor King, in due course, seen here, took Barrallier on as his personal aide-de-camp. So obviously he trusted him. And while in that capacity, Barrallier was sent as an ambassador to the King of the Blue Mountains, which seems a bit strange. It was really a ruse on King's part, or an excuse for an attempt to cross the mountains. Now, this was the only official attempt to cross the Blue Mountains, in that it was instigated and supported by a governor, up to and including the effort by Blackson, Lawson and Wentworth a decade later. Anyway, more of Barrallier's expedition later in my talk, because soon afterwards, in May 1803, just 3.5 years after he arrived, the wheels suddenly fell off. He became the meat in the sandwich, as Christine alluded to, in the long-running disputes between the Rum Corps and the governor, and he was obliged to leave the colony at a couple of days' notice. How could this happen to a person apparently so capable and trusted? Well, there's no doubt that Barrallier's French background played a part. We do know that Captain MacArthur called him the Frenchman, though we can't be sure whether he meant it in a disparaging way. We also know that Barrallier made some acerbic remarks about some people of this colony. One of those people was evidently his rival in exploration, the botanist George Cayley, but he may have been indicating a broader view about the English. Now, perhaps more significantly, he had interactions with the French expedition led by Nicolas Baudin, seen here. Now, that expedition visited the colony in 1802, sometime in the months before Barrallier's Blue Mountains expedition. He almost certainly met with Baudin himself, as well as several of the expedition's scientists. Now, the Baudin expedition was ostensibly a scientific affair, but it was also an intelligence gathering exercise, spying on the English. But it was a time of temporary peace with the French, so the expedition was cautiously welcomed by Governor King. In fact, warmly welcomed by Governor King. Some of the Corps' officers weren't so happy and accused the Baudin's people, among other things, of selling spirits, thereby undermining the Corps' infamous trade. This was still a simmering issue months after the Baudin people left, feeding into the ongoing wider disputes with the governor. Now, Barrallier's former associations with the visitors probably made him a target, as did his own Frenchness. He was somehow persuaded to make some derogatory remarks about Governor King. Perhaps they plied him with some rum to do so. The remarks were undoubtedly uttered in private, but were made public by those campaigning against the governor. So when the governor, King, discovered the source of the remarks, he promptly sacked Barrallier as his aide-de-camp, an action he seems to have regretted later, but that was that. Finding himself unwelcome back in the Corps, Barrallier submitted his resignation and was packed off back to England a couple of days later. Back in England, his resignation from the army was never accepted, and he gained support for returning to the colony, perhaps from this man, Joseph Banks. He underwent further training in surveying, and in 1806, some years later, nearly returned to the colony as Surveyor General with Governor Bligh. However, he was gazumped by Charles Grimes, arguably a less capable surveyor and cartographer. Perhaps Barrallier's French nationality, or indeed his Frenchness, worked against him. Instead, Barrallier went off to the West Indies for about 10 years, initially as a lieutenant in the 90th Regiment. There he participated mainly as an engineer in various battles against his countrymen and earned a few medals for his trouble. And he soon became aide-de-camp to Major General George Beckwith, commander of the British forces in the West Indies. That was a position of trust indeed. And then he finally received his longed-for Surveyor General appointment, not of New South Wales, but of Barbados. The purpose was to properly map the island. The task was completed shortly before peace broke out with the French, and he was demobilised. The rest of his long life I won't go into in detail. He lived to 1853, aged almost 80. He spent the years variously in France and in England, and among other things, he completed his map of Barbados, drew plans for a new port at Barbados, possibly drew plans for a Russian port on the Baltic coast, drew up a plan of a bridge over the Thames that was never built, married an English woman named Isabel Skirm, 24 years his junior, and advanced to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. So, I'm now going to address the first of the two most interesting aspects of his legacy, and that has to do with his work as a surveyor and cartographer. As I mentioned, Barrallier's first surveying assignment was at Bass Strait, and that was in 1801 on the Lady Nelson, seen here. It was a coastal surveying ship that had been built specially for the purpose. It was commanded by Lieutenant Grant. After some minor survey at Jervis Bay, they proceeded to Bass Strait, and Barrallier surveyed some of the coast of today's Victoria before Flinders got there. And he spent a month exploring and surveying Western Port, which had been discovered previously by George Bass. The nearby Port Phillip Bay hadn't been discovered, so Western Port was being considered for its potential. Now, Barrallier commenced the survey by establishing a baseline on the northern shore of Phillip Island. Now, that was done by estimating distance based on the time delay between observing and hearing cannon fire on the Lady Nelson. After that, he went off in a small boat for several days at a time with various assistants. The work wasn't without incident. On one occasion, he nearly lost his life when the boat was swamped and almost capsized in a tidal disturbance. Anyway, back in Sydney, Barrallier produced this map called the Chart of Western Port and the Coast to Wilson's Promontory. It's seen here subsequently engraved by the Hydrographic Office in England. Now, here's an enlargement of the Western Port portion. It's fairly accurate given the conditions and the techniques used. You can see Port Phillip down at the bottom, and towards the top centre, there's a tiny islet that was named after himself. Modest indeed. Interestingly, the only other features which now carry Barrallier's name are in the Blue Mountains at locations he never actually went to. But there's a problem with this map. You might see that it shows the port as having two large arms with a large peninsula in between. The fact is, it isn't really a peninsula at all, it's an island. Those two arms join around the back. it seems that the shallow waters and issues with the tide and weather prevented Barrallier from discovering that. Now, a few months later in Sydney, he drew this map of Bass Strait and Van Diemen's Land. It's based on the surveys by himself, Matthew Flinders and Captain John Murray, and a few other ships that had passed through the Bass Strait by then. Now, here's an enlargement of the Western Port bit of that map. When Barrallier drew this, there'd been no more exploration of Western Port by the English. John Murray, in the Lady Nelson on a subsequent trip, had entered it and sheltered there while on the trip when he discovered Port Phillip Bay nearby, but he didn't further explore Western Port. And yet on this map, Barallier's large peninsula in Western Port has magically turned into an island, imaginatively named Western Island. How did that happen? Well, the answer is that soon after Murray's visit, the Baudin expedition ship Naturaliste sailed in there under command of Pierre Bernard Milius. They did some surveying of their own, and it was subsequently represented on this map by the cartographer Pierre Faure. The survey was generally inferior to Barallier's work, but they did discover that the peninsula was really an island. To quote the French botanist Theodore Leschenol, who was with them, citizen Milius began to suspect, due to the shape and lie of the land, that this channel was connected to the first. And so he set out in the small dinghy, which confirmed that the English chart was incorrect. Now, he was referring to Barallier's first chart, which they hadn't actually seen at the time. As I explain in my book, it's clear that when the Baudin people later reached Sydney, they got their heads together with Barrallier and compared work. Barrallier modified his plan, and it was presumably suggested, in a spirit of cooperation, that the newly defined island should be called French Island, and the large island at the entrance to the bay would be called English Island, or as shown on Faure's map here, Ile des Français and Ile des Anglais. The name French Island was indeed eventually adopted by the English, but they retained the name Phillip Island, which they'd already chosen. So now there is no English island, only French Island. And you could say the French won. Now I've confused you all. Let's head north of Sydney to the Hunter. This was Barallier's second major assignment, and it followed closely on the Bass Strait exercise. It comprised two trips, the first one of which involved a significant expedition into the area led by Colonel William Patterson, head of the Corps, and Barallier's boss. Now, this is John Lewin's drawing of the Lady Nelson and the accompanying schooner approaching Nobby's Head to enter the river mouth at today's Newcastle. Barallier's survey was conducted over several rather wet winter weeks. After surveying the harbour area and its islands and channels, he surveyed the lower Hunter and Williams rivers by boat. This would have involved somehow measuring distances and taking bearings along each reach of the rivers. A very difficult task given the bends, the currents, and underwater snags. This is the map Barrallier produced, turned sideways so that north points up. The bit down at the bottom is just an enlargement of the harbour area. There was actually a second version, differing only in the scale of that harbour enlargement. Now, here's an enlargement of the river portion. Now, this is a remarkably accurate map, given the limited techniques available to Barrallier. It's also quite a nice piece of cartography. The only real issue is this. Above the confluence of the Hunter and Williams rivers, the Hunter River is labelled as the Patterson River, and the Williams River is labelled as the Hunter River. The Patterson River that we know wasn't explored and so wasn't then named. Now, was this an error by Barrallier, as is sometimes suggested, a cartographic error? Well, no. The names were applied precisely as intended by Patterson, who was in charge. The various reports and diaries prove that to be the case. Perhaps their perception was that the main arm of the river was today's Williams River, and it's easy to get that impression because here's a photo taken looking downstream at the confluence. That's the Williams entering from behind left and the Hunter from the right. The Williams certainly appears to be the larger river at that point, and it may well have had a greater flow at the time, given the rains. So they called it the Hunter. Now, later that year, Barrallier made a second trip to the area, this time with fellow surveyor Charles Grimes, during which they surveyed the lower Patterson River. Now, we don't know, or we don't have the resulting map or any account saying what they call the Patterson River. However, Matthew Flinders' 1814 Chart of Terra Australis, seen here, seems to have faithfully adopted Barrallier's mapping and nomenclature and labels the Patterson River the Williams River, presumably as Barrallier and Grimes intended. So we have the Hunter, the Williams and the Patterson rivers, but each was attached to a different river compared with today's understanding. And I'm sorry if I've now confused you again. The question is, when did the three rivers' names switch to their modern application? And the answer is, I'm not sure. This map, produced around 1820, presents an accurate tracing of Barrallier's mapping, suggesting that no more survey and mapping had been done at the time, but unfortunately the rivers aren't labelled at all, only the river reaches. Perhaps the cartographer in this case was confused by differing opinions. My guess is that the switch occurred in the 1820s when surveyor Henry Dangar was active in the area. But why were they switched? If it was a mistake, perhaps we should be drinking not Hunter River wines, but Patterson Valley wines. So there's a challenge for someone who switched the names when and why. Now, moving on to the Blue Mountains expedition and the mapping there. Here are the maps that Barrallier produced showing his route in the mountains in two parts. They were criticised by Barrallier's fellow explorer, George Cayley, and by more recent commentators for their lack of accuracy, particularly to do with scale. And I think those criticisms have reflected overall on Barrallier's understood competency in his time. But the fact is they were only sketches, and Barrallier called them that. He wasn't making a survey this time. His distances were only estimates as he walked through the rough, untracked country, and he only took occasional bearings. Barrallier wasn't alone. Other surveyors grossly overestimated their distance, just like Barrallier did, when they were not actually surveying with a chain. I'll come back to the Blue Mountains expedition again. Now, finally, on the mapping business, and perhaps of most interest, is this map of Barbados. Here it is. It's pretty large. It's in a number of sections all joined together here. It was produced at his own expense in England after he was demobilised. It's a fine piece of work in terms of both the surveying and the cartography. It's a perfect example of the ordnance survey style that had only recently been introduced. Cartographic historian Jim Webster has geo-referenced the map and found it to be remarkably accurate for its time. Notably, it's superior to the work of Barrallier's contemporaries back in New South Wales, Charles Grimes, George Evans and John Oxley. One must wonder how the surveying and mapping of the colony might have turned out if Barrallier had returned to the colony with Governor Bligh. But there's more. The fact is, this map has real and significant legacy. Barbados was a slave colony growing sugarcane, and for whatever reason, Barrallier took the trouble not only to map all the individual plantations, but to list all the plantation owners down at the bottom. You can see them there. It turns out that the map is now a unique source of information for the campaign for restorative justice for the descendants of the slave community of Barbados. It has been used for that purpose by the University College of London. As you may know, when the British government abolished slavery, it was only able to do so by paying off the so-called slave owners. The slaves themselves received no compensation at all. So Barrallier's list of slave owners now comes in pretty handy. And here is Barrallier's map on the UCL website, slightly distorted to correct the scale error in the original. Now, Barrallier may not have had socially advanced ideas in mind when he produced that map with all the names, or perhaps he did. Regardless, it makes a perfect segue to the second area of his legacy that I'd like to talk about. And that has to do with his unsuccessful attempt to cross the Blue Mountains. From today's perspective, the importance of that expedition lies not in the topographic lessons learnt, but in the first contact stories and perspectives that emerge from it. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of the trip, but here are some maps to give some context. On this first one, the route of the famous Blackson, Lawson and Wentworth expedition of 1813 is shown by the red dashed line from the Nepean River at Penrith, at the right-hand end of the dashed line, across the mountains to Mount Blackson. Now, they relied on some received intelligence and degrees of luck and good judgment to follow a ridge most of the way. Though they didn't actually cross the divide, that was left to surveyor George Evans. This map shows a reconnaissance trip that Barrallier made in 1802 as a precursor to his main expedition. He started at Windsor, up at the top right, and worked southwards, parallel to the mountains. He was really just looking for any obvious passage through the mountains, which didn't actually exist. But he settled on a site for a depot as a starting point for his main endeavour, and that's down the bottom of the dashed line. It's a place that he called Natai, and that name came from the Aboriginal guide at the time, the Dharawal man Gogi. And the location is, for people who know that region, between Picton and Thirlmere and the Oaks, at the head of a creek called Shays Creek, which flows into the Natai River. Now, this map, on this map, the tram lines show the routes of his main expedition of November-December 1802. The first part, starting at Parramatta on the extreme right of the map, involved taking a bullock cart to the depot that I mentioned via Menangle, Picton and Thirlmere. And then the cart went backwards and forwards with provisions while Barrallier made 3 forays into the mountains. In doing so, he relied variously on Aboriginal guides and intermediaries, predominantly Gogi, who I mentioned, and another Dharawal man who was a boy really, named Budbury. Now, all 3 forays involved passing through the Burragarang Valley, now partially flooded by Warragamba Dam. And the most extensive foray, which you can see heading off to the left there, finished up in very rugged country. He finished up at a waterfall southwest of Canangra Walls, really hopelessly short of crossing the divide. Suffice to say that he unfortunately chose what turned out to be one of the most topographically complicated and rugged parts of the Blue Mountains region. He was going across the grain of the mountains. There was no simple ridge to follow in that part. Even if his Aboriginal assistants knew a way, which they didn't, because they got beyond their own country, it would have been impossible for him to complete a crossing because of their inappropriate equipment and skill. So just a couple of pictures of the terrain he went through. This is part of the Natai Valley. This is the Burragarang Valley that he traversed before heading into more rough country. He went through the pass in the foreground, but also climbed that peak in the middle. And this is a view he had back from where he was at that stage. Later on, he descended into an extremely deep, wild valley. This is the Cowmung River. And then he had these sorts of things confronting him that caused him to try following a tributary creek, which also got quite rough, like this. And in the end, he finished up at this waterfall. And at this stage, there was the old story, boots falling to bits, provisions running short. And even though he had a couple of young Aboriginal assistants, really it was time to head back with his entourage of soldiers and convicts, as well as the Aboriginal assistants. Now, while the expedition was unsuccessful, it was very significant and that he left us with 3 letters to Governor King written from the field and a 20,000-word journal. Now, this is the first page of that journal. It wasn't his original journal. It was only a small part of the original, which survives in translated form only. Now, this is a rewrite conducted with the encouragement of Joseph Banks. It's in French and it's in the UK National Archives. Barrallier probably hoped that it would be published in his time, but that never happened. Instead, it was published years later in the Historical Records of New South Wales in the 1890s, complete with some errors of transcription and translation. Recently, my friend Milena Bellini-Shepherd has produced a revised transcription and translation, and I've published it online. It's now freely accessible on Trove, as you can see here. Now, the revised translation doesn't provide any great new insights into the expedition, except I reckon one. In the Historical Records translation, Barrallier's 3 probes into the mountains are described as excursions. Ever since then, historians have thus talked about Barrallier's 3 excursions, as if they were some sort of jolly school trip. In fact, however, Barrallier used the word incursion, which translates to incursion. Now, I don't know exactly what Barrallier had in mind when he used that word. He may have meant it in the military sense, he probably did. But regardless, it's a word that should encourage us to think clearly about the fact that Barrallier was not only probing into unknown rugged terrain, he was also entering or invading people's country. For it's a fact that the journal tells a unique first contact story. It's quite unlike any other early explorer's journal in terms of its detail and insights. For a start, it's quite special in terms of how it demonstrates Barrallier's engagement with country, his sense of place, if you like. But in my view, the most significant thing is the degree of cultural understanding that Barrallier demonstrates. Now, he certainly makes his share of sweeping statements about the supposedly innately cruel nature of Aboriginal people and so on, reflecting the common view of the time. And no less than Manning Clark has criticised them for that, but I think unfairly. But when we analyse what went on in the expedition and some of the details of his commentary, we can see him in a different light. Some 15 Gundunga and Dharawal people either accompanied the expedition or were met with, including a Gundunga clan chief named Gundul. Barrallier refers to 10 of those people by their proper names, and he tells us much about who they were, what they wore, what they ate, and what they were up to. No other early explorer was so engaged. For their part, Blackson, Lawson and Wentworth had no Aboriginal companions at all, and Blackson himself thought they were useless. Barrallier seems to have had friendly and conciliatory relations with all of those people at a time when a state of war had arisen mainly between many of the colonists and the First Nations people. In one case, he seems to have diffused a potential major incident arising from the actions of George Cayley, who happens to be out in the same area trying to figure out what Barrallier was up to. Best of all, he seems to have understood something about Aboriginal ownership of country, of their country. In one of his letters to Governor King, he wrote, and this is an accurate translation, our man Bungan told us that the chief of the party was Gundul and that the country where we were belonged to him. And at one place in his journal, he wrote this, Gogi told me that by following that river, I would enter the territory or country of a tribe who do not use the Woomera. So enter the country of a tribe. He also understood that there were protocols of entering country and meeting people. He wrote this in his journal, the natives do not allow any stranger to inhabit the territories they have appropriated to themselves. You could say the country that belongs to them. And indeed, In his two encounters, in Barallier's two encounters with the Gundungurra clan chief Gundul, he seems to have observed appropriate protocols. Now, these ideas run contrary to the terra nullius idea, which of course prevailed, that the country belonged to no one. As far as I can see, no other early colonial figure referred to the matter of Aboriginal land ownership. Commentators like Governors Phillip and Hunter and David Collins mentioned how people were living here and there, but didn't introduce the idea that different groups were attached to particular areas and possessed those areas. So where did Barallier's special perspectives come from? Possibly from his Aboriginal companions, but I don't think that would have been enough. He had to be open to those ideas. So did his Frenchness have something to do with it? I think when we look at his life as a whole, despite being employed by the British, he assuredly identified as French, and the British saw him as a Frenchman. What exactly was a French identity? The differences between the English and French were possibly more imagined than real. I think it wasn't so much that he was French as such, but that he wasn't English. Perhaps he got his somewhat progressive attitudes, though, from his interactions with the people of the Baudin expedition. As I've mentioned, he probably spent some time with Nicholas Baudin, as well as the various scientists of the expedition. Now, as it happens, on the very day Barrallier arrived back in Sydney after his expedition, the very day, Baudin was on an island in Bass Strait with his people, penning a letter to his friend Governor King. The letter arose from a rather comic incident in which King accused Baudin of taking land that the English had already claimed. I won't go into the details of that. The important thing is what Baudin wrote in his letter to King. Here it is, as translated by Jean Fonaciero. My apologies for my French. But he said, "It has always been inconceivable to me that there was any justice or even fairness on the part of Europeans in seizing, in the name of their government, a land they saw for the first time when it was inhabited by people who did not always deserve the titles of savages and cannibals that were lavished on them, even though they were still only nature's children and no more uncivilised than your present-day Scottish Highlanders or our peasants of Lower Brittany, etc., who, while they may not eat their fellow men, are no less harmful to them for all that." I'll just repeat the first bit. "It has always been inconceivable to me that there was any justice or even fairness on the part of Europeans in seizing, in the name of their government, a land they saw for the first time when it was inhabited by people." Well, I guess that rather holier-than-thou perspective ran contrary to the behaviour of the French generally, and perhaps to most of the people in Baudin's expedition. But it does indicate that it was possible to hold such a view, and maybe some of it had rubbed off on Barrallier, his countryman. So in conclusion, by the standards of the time, Barrallier was an excellent surveyor and cartographer. He also took an uncommon interest in our First Nations people and expressed a grasp of the significance of their attachment to country that was possibly unheard of in his time. Something of a square peg in the colony, his encounters with the Baudin people, including Nicholas Baudin himself, perhaps provided the intellectual stimulation that underpinned what he thought and wrote. The mere fact that he wasn't English broadened his mind and gave him license to think differently and be open to a more enlightened view. But while his interactions with the Baudin people may have worked positively to enlighten his perspectives on First Nations people, they may have also played a negative contribution in the events that led to his downfall in the colony. Had the Baudin people never come here, Barallier's career in the colony may have endured, and he would likely have made substantial contributions to developments, though perhaps with a less sympathetic eye to the traditional owners of the country. So, folks, if you'd like to learn more about anything I've covered today, including much more about the Blue Mountains expedition, you'll find it in my book, If you can't find a copy in your local independent bookshop, you can certainly find one on my website, andymacqueen.com. And with apologies for that little promo, I'll hand back to Christine.
Thank you so much. And I have an immediate question, and I'll jump in if you don't mind. The map of Barbados, has that been inscribed on the UNESCO National Memory of the World Register? Because that's my colleague Ros Russell has done a lot of work with the in terms of documentary heritage work with Barbados, and I jumped up with excitement when you talked about that map.
Look, I don't know the answer to that, Christine. It's a map that's received a bit of attention, not only with the University College, but in a paper about the history of mapping of Barbados by Jim Webster. So I'd be surprised if it hasn't received that sort of recognition.
Oh, well, I'll look into it. Thank you very much for drawing my attention to it. It's great.
So if anyone has any other questions, now is the time to put them into the Q&A or the chat. We have received one from Mary Fletcher, who wants to know if you've seen a video from the year 2000 called The King of the Mountains, which traces the journey of Francis Barrallier and his early attempts to cross the mountains. Have you seen that at all?
I don't believe I have, and I'd be interested to know what it shows. The interesting thing about the expedition is that until fairly recent times, the main focus was on people trying to figure out where he went exactly, and it all became very controversial with different viewpoints. But needless to say, my interpretation's the only correct one. But but in all seriousness, as I've sort of suggested, I think it's more important that the cultural matters are more important than the details of where he went now. But yes, for most of the last century, people were more preoccupied with the whole thing about where he went and the fate of the expedition rather than the cultural side.
I have a question actually, Andy. So his two Aboriginal guides, Goggy and Budberry, did they receive much, I guess, celebrity in the colony for being guides?
Not particularly as a result of that expedition, but they both made names for themselves subsequently. Goggy was a very complex character and has been written up in quite a number of books and academic papers. He was quite a mercurial man. There hasn't really been time in my presentation to go into the details of his, but since there's a few minutes to spare, I could say a bit more about him. He was a mercurial man. Subsequent to this expedition, he got involved in all sorts of matters in the colony, including various traditional fights with Bennelong and so on. But Goggy, although being a valuable guide in the early stages, became something of a problem because it turned out he had some bad history with the Gundungurra people. And the very first incursion into the mountains, when they met Gundul, Goggy decided his life was in danger from those people and he wanted to retreat. And subsequently, there was an extremely harrowing incident in which Goggy beat up his wife back at the depot. And that's been the subject of an analysis by all sorts of people. I've put my own take on it in my book. Sometimes that incident is people have taken to reflect on Barrallier himself. I think perhaps a little unfairly, but yeah, So basically, Goggy did become a well-known person. He wasn't so well-known at this time, but he became well-known for all sorts of other things he was involved in. Woodbury was a pretty young character at this time. He subsequently, some years later, was a guide to Macquarie when he showed Macquarie down into some of that same country. Yeah.
And look, I always find when people who aren't English come to, or aren't British, come to the colony, I always find that their opinions are interesting because they're somewhat of an outsider. Did Francis have anything to say about the colony, or was he too yeah, did he have anything to say about the colony that
Oh,
might have been out of place?
I'm sure he did, but unfortunately, those records didn't exist. There was just that little clip that I like where he referred to, some people in this colony in a very rather disparaging way, and we don't know whether he was just singling out one or two people, or behind it was a broader frustration. Yeah. So yes, it's one of those. Unfortunately, apart from a couple of official letters, uh, we don't have a whole pile of correspondence that he wrote, which is a great shame.
We've received a few questions in the chat now, I see. Judy would like to know, um, other than that French explorer Bodwin, did Francis have any other contact with any other French in the South Pacific?
Not that we know of, no. But there were other French people in the colony at the time of various ilk, and it's very likely he met them. But otherwise, there's no record of anything. No.
And Robin just wants you to know that as well as all the memorials that are in the Blue Mountains, Andy, you might be interested to know there is a street in Raymond Terrace named after Barrallier as well.
Oh yes, yes. Sorry, yes. And I think there might be a Barrallier Street in Western Sydney too. So yeah, yeah.
So, are there any other questions, Christine?
Yes, his approach to trying to cross the Blue Mountains, what I mean, you probably did say, and it just kind of went over my head. How was his approach different from that of Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth?
Okay, so I guess his approach was essentially a military one. We've got not a lot had been. Well, there'd been no official attempts to cross the Blue Mountains at that stage. Well, correction, in 1798, Governor Hunter had sent a fellow called John Wilson on a couple of trips, essentially to prove that the Blue Mountains couldn't be crossed, which turned out to be wrong because he did, in fact, end up nearly at Goulburn, but that's another story. John Wilson travelled very light because he'd been living with Aboriginal people and knew how to travel light. But that aside, nobody really knew at that stage how it should be properly tackled. So Barallier's approach was, the sort of military model, where originally he was going to set up a chain of depots where there'd be a cart going out there, provisioning each depot as they went. But that obviously a bullock cart wasn't going to penetrate very far into the Blue Mountains, and that wasn't really successful, which is really why he wasn't able to go too far into the mountains once he left his depot. Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth, as I did allude to, so they were pretty. There had a certain amount of intelligence and been gathered by that stage, and they received some advice, almost certainly from George Cayley, who by the time Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth were there, George Cayley had done quite a bit more in the area, had been to Mount Banks and got a handle on the terrain in the central Blue Mountains, and he almost certainly spoke to Lawson, and Lawson got some clues from that. So they, one way or another, they were able to pick a route that was far more viable than any route that could have been chosen where Barrallier chose to do his crossing. And they took horses which helped take their supplies. So it was a different approach, essentially. Yeah.
They went across the ridges, is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So the way they went, there was a central ridge that took them most of the way across. And there were sort of cliffs on one side of that ridge for a lot of it, which helped guide them, if you like. Yeah.
Thank you, Christine, for the question. We have one from Greg, and he would like to congratulate you on your book, Andy. He really enjoyed it. You mentioned there are a few records of Barrallier's thoughts, but is there a particular record that gave you the best insight into his character?
Look, I look, obviously there's there's letters from his benefactors in England that write all sorts of praise about him, but you can always take those sorts of things with a grain of salt. I think the best insight into his character is just a reading of his journal, personally, uh, and, uh, and what he says about the people he meets and his thinking behind what he's doing. I personally, I think that provides the best insights.
Mhm. Good, thank you. Oh,
And Helen would like to know what started this research journey? What sparked your interest in starting to read about
Okay, so many years ago, when I was still a teenager, I took a walk into the Gundungurra country with a wonderful map that was called Gundungurra. I had no idea what Gundungurra meant at that stage, but I was totally absorbed by this wonderful southern Blue Mountains country. Um, yeah, I moved interstate for some years. When I came back, as a bushwalker, I resumed my interest in the area. And I thought, oh, I'll try and solve this riddle of exactly where Barrallier went, like many other people did. But I broadened my interest into the man in general. Now, I've actually published a little book back in 1993 about Barrallier, a predecessor to this book. And that this recent book, presents a lot more information. Look, for years, for any historians out there, I'm sure you appreciate that it's extremely difficult to return to a topic 30 years on. And for years, I resisted that. But as new information started to emerge, thanks to the information age and material that other people were uncovering and writing, I was thinking about doing it, but more importantly, I wanted to bring forward some new perspectives. So 30 years ago, the significance of the cultural matters and the whole first contact story wasn't as foremost in my mind as it became subsequently. I mean, times have changed. So I was really driven by the need to pay more attention to what went on culturally and to give, I mean, I thought 30 years ago, I don't think I really appreciated that all those people that Barrallier met with almost certainly have living descendants today. And I know some of them now, and those people needed to be given. They weren't just archaeological, artifacts. Those people that Barrallier met, they were real people with living descendants today.
yeah, it's fascinating actually, and I find interesting, particularly the attempt to cross the Blue Mountains, but and I suppose, yes, comparing it with what happened a bit later, and of course the opening up of the mountains. And one of the things that I have found extraordinary is that when Charles Darwin visited New South Wales, visited Sydney, he went with someone else, and they just had a horse each, and they went across. They just rode across and went to Bathurst. I mean, as though you would just go out for a day's riding. So quite extraordinary.
Yes, well, there's all sorts of interesting journals and diaries of people crossing the mountains once Blackstone and so forth had gone across, and then a bit of a road was built by Cox. But of course, they all make interesting reading because today, providing the sort of traffic jam as there often is, everybody just cruises over in a couple of hours, but it still took people 2 or 3 days, and with perhaps the odd hardship on the way. Yeah, it's all fascinating.
Yeah.
And all that country that Barrallier went into, most of it is declared wilderness. And the beauty of Barrallier's journey, if you like, is that you can follow his footsteps and have, especially in the western end of his trip, have the same difficult experience as he had.
Well, we might wrap it up there for today. I just want to say thank you for presenting to us today, Andy. It was a very interesting talk. Christine, I'll let you do the honours of closing today's session.
Well, yes, I too want to say thank you. It's terrific. You've covered so much, and I've learned so much, which is always great. I loved it when I listen to a talk and I think, oh yeah, I didn't know that before. So thank you very much for making the time. And it has been a great pleasure to have you come and join us via Zoom, because although we've opened up History House these days, it's still a chance for those who can't get into the city to take part. So thank you very much. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Virtual thank you.
Much accepted. Thank you.
Thank you.